The air was thick with grief, the scent of lilies and candle wax pressing against my chest as I stood before my sister's coffin. My heart ached with loss, but even in that moment of sorrow, I could never have imagined the storm about to break. As the priest's voice droned softly in the background, I tried to hold myself together. My sister was gone, and I thought the day couldn't grow darker. But then, without warning, my husband rose from his seat. His shoes scraped against the stone floor, sharp and jarring in the silence. He pointed straight at me, his face twisted with rage. And then, in front of every mourner, he delivered the words that shattered my world. "You are the killer of your sister." Gasps erupted. Faces turned. Some recoiled in horror. Others stared at me as though I carried death itself on my hands. My knees threatened to give way, my soul splintering under the weight of betrayal. I wasn't just grieving my sister. I was being condemned as her murderer. And yet, as the silence stretched and the whispers tightened around me like chains, I had no idea what was coming next. Because 10 minutes later, a phone call would ring through the church. A call that would expose a dark secret. A call that would change everything. My name is Claire Morgan, and this is the day my world shattered. I kept my eyes on the white lilies because looking anywhere else hurt too much. The church smelled of wax and wilted flowers. The pews were packed with faces I half recognized from childhood birthdays and weddings, all blurred by the heat of grief. My sister's photo rested on an easel near the altar, her smile frozen midsummer, the kind of smile that made you believe bad things wouldn't dare come near us. I tried to breathe. I tried to be the kind of strong you're supposed to be when everyone is watching. The priest spoke about mercy, about love, about how a life doesn't end so much as it changes addresses. I held those words like a lifeline because the last 2 days had felt like drowning. I squeezed the handkerchief in my fist until the lace cut half-moons into my skin. People shuffled, coughed, sniffled. Somewhere behind me, a child asked in a whisper why the grown-ups were crying, and the mother answered with a hush that made the silence heavier. Then my husband stood. The scrape of wood on stone snapped every head in our row toward him. He didn't look at me. He looked past me, over me, like I wasn't there. His jaw was set, eyes glassy, with a fury I didn't recognize. "I need to say something," he announced, and the priest, startled, faltered to a stop. "You don't interrupt eulogies. You don't interrupt grief." But he did. He pointed. At me. "You," he said, voice low and even, "are the killer of your sister." The words didn't hit me at once. They arrived in pieces, like glass raining down. First the point, then the sentence, then the rip through the room. The church froze. Breaths were held. A hymn book slipped from someone's fingers and thudded against the floor, a dull, accusing sound. The crowd gasped, some turned away in shock, while others stared at me like I had blood on my hands. My heart fractured in one clean break. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. I wasn't just grieving. I was suddenly on trial, standing in the dock without a lawyer, without a voice. In the front row, my aunt clutched her pearls and looked between us, as if her eyes could stitch the moment back together. A cousin dragged his gaze over me like a verdict. My mother pressed a shaky hand to her lips. Even the priest seemed unsure of scripture. "Don't be fooled by her tears," my husband continued, louder now, riding the wave of his own certainty. "She knows what she did." I thought of all the quiet hours I had spent with my sister the week before, the tea gone cold on the kitchen counter, the late-night messages, the promise I made to call her in the morning. I thought of the text she never answered. Sorrow swelled so wide inside me it nearly split my ribs. With one sentence, he turned my tears into evidence against me. Whispers sprouted and spread, crawling across the pews like ivy. "Did you hear? Was there a fight? Is it true?" I felt the church shrink around me, the arched ceiling lowering until the stained glass pressed its colors against my skin. Somewhere to my right, a woman I didn't know pulled her child closer, like grief might be catching. I forced myself to stand. If I stayed seated, I would never stand again. But my knees shook, and the aisle seemed to tilt. I could hear my pulse in my ears, a hard, frightened drum. I searched my husband's face for any sign of the man who once kissed my wrists when I cried. There was nothing familiar there, only a hard, bright certainty that made me want to vanish. "I loved her," I said, finally, but the words were so small they dissolved before they reached the first row. No one moved. The stillness felt deliberate, as if the entire room had agreed to pause time until a truth chose a side. 10 minutes stretched like a bridge over a canyon, long, thin, ready to snap. In those minutes, I stood in the wreckage of my life, measuring the distance between who I was and who the room now believed me to be. I counted breaths and stared at the lilies and tried to remember that I had a heart before it broke. Somewhere in the back, a phone began to vibrate against wood. Once, then again, an insect hum that grew louder with each ignored ring, threading its way through the hush, promising nothing and threatening everything. I didn't turn. I couldn't. I just held onto the pew with one hand and the last unbroken piece of myself with the other, waiting for whatever would cross that thin, shaking bridge next. The phone kept buzzing, sharp against the heavy silence of the church. At first, no one dared to move. It was as though the ringing itself had become another mourner, demanding to be heard. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging nervous glances, while I stood frozen, my husband's words still echoing like a curse in my skull. Finally, my cousin Mark reached into his coat pocket and answered. "Hello." His voice trembled, carrying through the hushed pews. All eyes darted toward him, desperate for a distraction from the venom that had just poisoned the service. I watched as his face drained of color. His hand, clutching the phone, began to shake. He glanced at me, then at my husband, then back at the coffin as though he were staring at something none of us could see. "What do you mean?" Mark's voice cracked. "Are you certain?" The crowd leaned in unconsciously, like a field of stalks swayed by one sudden gust of wind. Even the priest took a hesitant step forward, eyes narrowing in concern. Mark ended the call with trembling fingers and rose to his feet. I have to say this," he stammered. His throat worked hard, trying to swallow words that clearly wanted to explode. "That was the police." The word police cut through the church like a blade. Murmurs rose instantly, low but frantic, people clutching their chests or craning their necks to hear more. Mark inhaled deeply, bracing himself. "They've just confirmed my cousin," he pointed toward the coffin. "She didn't die the way we thought. There's evidence of foul play." A collective gasp tore through the room, louder than before. I staggered back a step, clutching the pew, my breath caught in my chest. My husband's jaw tightened, but his eyes betrayed a flicker. Fear, quick and sharp, before he smothered it. The whispers turned again, this time like a tide shifting direction. Faces that had glared at me only minutes earlier now swung toward him. Suspicion spread like wildfire, hotter, hungrier, eager for a new target. Mark's voice shook as he went on. "The investigation points to someone close. Someone who tried to shift the blame." He swallowed, his eyes locking on my husband. "Someone who wanted to frame an innocent person." The room erupted. Relatives gasped. My aunt clutched her chest. My mother's sob broke through the noise like glass shattering. All I could do was stare at the man I once trusted with my life, as his mask began to slip before the entire world. And in that moment I realized I was no longer the accused. I was the witness. The church no longer felt sacred. It felt like a courtroom. My husband stood rigid, fists clenched at his sides, his eyes darting across the mourners like a cornered animal searching for an exit. 10 minutes earlier, he had been the executioner, painting me as a murderer in front of everyone. Now, with one phone call, suspicion had twisted and wrapped itself around him like a noose. People began whispering his name. Not mine, his. "Why would he say that?" one woman hissed. "Did he know something we didn't?" another asked. The air, heavy with grief minutes ago, now throbbed with accusation. I felt my knees weaken, but this time not from shame, from relief. For the first time since he'd pointed his finger at me, I could breathe without feeling knives in my chest. I still hurt, I still mourned, but the weight of 1,000 eyes no longer pressed down on me alone. Lies. My husband spat suddenly, his voice cracking. All lies. They're trying to confuse you. He gestured wildly, as though the crowd itself were guilty. He jabbed a finger toward me again, desperation dripping from every syllable. She knows what happened. She's behind this. But the more he shouted, the more the crowd pulled back. Their silence was no longer compliance, it was judgment. The same relatives who had stared at me with suspicion now folded their arms, lips pursed, their gazes pinning him instead. Even the priest, who moments ago looked too stunned to intervene, straightened his shoulders and said firmly, "Sir, this is a place of mourning, not accusation." My husband's face flushed crimson. "You're all blind," he roared. "Can't you see?" But the more he fought, the more he exposed himself. His anger was no longer righteous. It was desperate, frantic, unraveling in front of every witness. And then my cousin Mark, still pale from the call, added the final nail. "The police said they want to speak to him directly." The room gasped again, a ripple of sound that seemed to shake the stained glass. All eyes turned. Not to me this time. Not to the coffin. To him. I watched as his confidence shattered. The man who once swore to protect me now stood trembling, his lies collapsing under the weight of truth. And for the first time since my sister's death, I felt something new stirring beneath my grief. Justice. The tension in the church reached a breaking point. People shifted in their seats, whispers buzzing like hornets. My husband's chest heaved, his shirt clinging to him with sweat. He looked less like a grieving widower and more like a man caught in a trap. Then, the heavy doors at the back of the church creaked open. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their polished shoes echoing against the stone floor. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. "Excuse us," one officer announced, his voice calm but firm. "We're here on official business." Every head turned. Some mourners craned their necks. Others shrank back into the pews. The priest bowed his head slightly, as though surrendering control of the room. My heart thudded. This was real. This wasn't just whispers or accusations anymore. This was the law stepping into my sister's funeral. The taller officer scanned the room, his eyes narrowing when they landed on my husband. "Sir," he said, pointing straight at him, "we need you to come with us. There are questions regarding your sister-in-law's death." Gasps rippled again, louder, sharper. My husband froze. For the first time, he had no words. The color drained from his face as he shook his head in disbelief. "No," he stammered. "This is a mistake. She's the one. She." He jabbed his finger toward me once more, but the gesture fell flat. No one looked at me anymore. Every gaze was locked on him. "Enough," the officer snapped, stepping forward. "We're not here to debate in a church. You'll have your chance to explain yourself at the station." When the officers moved closer, my husband stepped back, nearly stumbling over the pew behind him. Murmurs turned into open accusations from the mourners. I knew something was off. How could he? She was his own family. I felt a strange calm wash over me. My grief was still there, raw and aching, but underneath it burned a quiet fire. He had tried to bury me with blame. Now he was the one being led away in front of everyone. The officers flanked him, guiding him toward the exit. He struggled once, but their grip tightened. His voice broke into a hoarse shout. "You'll regret this. All of you." No one answered. The doors slammed shut behind them, and silence filled the church again. Only this time, the silence wasn't heavy with suspicion. It was filled with truth. And I finally exhaled. The funeral continued, but it felt hollow. The hymns were sung, the prayers whispered, yet all anyone could think about was the man who had just been dragged out in handcuffs. My husband's absence was louder than his accusations had ever been. When the service ended, I stood by the coffin as mourners filed past, some offering me weak smiles, others apologetic glances. No one dared repeat the cruel words he had shouted. Instead, they whispered condolences with shame in their voices, as though embarrassed they had believed him, even for a moment. I held my sister's photo in trembling hands, whispering a silent promise. They will know the truth. I will make sure of it. By evening, the truth had already begun to unravel. The police called me directly, their voices heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. "Mrs. Hale," the detective said, "we've found evidence suggesting your husband was in contact with your sister the night she died." My blood ran cold. "In contact? What do you mean?"
"There were calls," he said.
"Messages. And financial records. Money was exchanged, large sums. We believe he had been pressuring her. When she refused, things escalated." I sank into a chair, my fingers clawing at the fabric of my dress. The room spun, grief folding into horror. My husband hadn't just betrayed me with words at the funeral, he had betrayed my entire family long before. The detective's tone hardened. "We also discovered your sister had confided in a friend. She feared someone close to her was trying to silence her. She even wrote your husband's name in her journal." The pieces crashed together in my mind like shards of glass. His sudden anger, his wild accusations, his desperate attempt to make me the scapegoat. All of it was a mask, a frantic attempt to bury his own guilt under the weight of mine. Tears blurred my vision, but this time they weren't only for my sister. They were for myself, for the years I spent beside a man who had hidden a monster inside his skin. The detective spoke again, softer now. "I know today was painful, but your sister's truth is surfacing. You need to be strong for what comes next." I gripped the phone tighter, my voice shaking but firm. "I will be. For her." When I hung up, the silence of the house pressed around me. But it wasn't the suffocating silence of accusation anymore. It was the silence before a storm, before justice. And I knew, as surely as I had ever known anything, that my husband's downfall had only just begun. The following morning, I was summoned to the station. The gray walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, and the faint smell of stale coffee pressed against my senses. Every step down the narrow hallway felt like a march toward the truth I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Through the glass, I saw him. My husband, the man who had once whispered promises in the dark, now slumped in a metal chair under a harsh spotlight. His tie was gone, his shirt wrinkled, his face pale. He looked smaller than I remembered, like the walls had already begun to close in. Detective Rose stood beside me. "We've been questioning him since last night. He's breaking." I swallowed hard. "What has he said?" Rowe glanced at his notes. "First, he denied everything. Then he tried to pin it on you again, but the evidence was too strong. Messages, bank transfers, phone records. He pressured your sister over money. She threatened to expose him, and we believe that confrontation turned violent." My knees weakened. I leaned against the wall, pressing my hand to my mouth. The image of my sister's final moments stabbed through me, her fear, her betrayal, the face she must have seen before the end. Rose's voice softened. "He slipped up this morning, admitted to being with her that night, claimed it was an accident, but the details don't add up. We're building the case for manslaughter, maybe worse." Inside the room, my husband suddenly slammed his fists on the table, his voice muffled through the glass. "She was supposed to keep quiet. She pushed me. I didn't mean for it to happen." The confession hung in the air like a death sentence. My chest tightened, my hands shook. Part of me wanted to rush in there, scream at him for what he had done, for destroying my sister, my family, my life. But another part of me stood still, rooted in a strange calm. His mask was gone. The world was seeing him for who he truly was. Rowe placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "You don't need to face him now. Focus on yourself. We'll take care of the rest." I nodded, though my throat ached. "No," I whispered. "I need to face him. He tried to ruin me in front of everyone. I need him to see that he failed." Minutes later, they allowed me into the room. He looked up as I entered, his eyes wild, his voice hoarse. "You," he hissed. "You ruined everything." I met his gaze without flinching. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You did that all by yourself." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. For the first time, I felt the scales shifting, not just toward justice but toward freedom. The courthouse smelled of old wood and dust, its walls lined with portraits of judges who had long since passed, but still seemed to watch every case unfold. I walked through the double doors with my head high, though inside, my stomach twisted with knots. Every step echoed like a warning. This was the moment everything would be laid bare. Reporters waited on the steps outside, their cameras flashing, their voices overlapping in a frenzy. "Did you really kill your sister?" one shouted, the cruel question slicing through the crowd. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, not anymore. The truth was finally on my side. Inside, the gallery buzzed with whispers. Family, neighbors, strangers who had read about the case, all waiting to hear how the man who once stood beside me in marriage vows would now stand accused of murder. He entered in shackles, flanked by officers. My husband, the man who had humiliated me at my sister's funeral, looked nothing like the confident accuser of that day. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling. Yet when he saw me, he sneered, as if clinging to the last shred of control he thought he had. The prosecution laid out the case piece by piece. Bank records showing the money he extorted from my sister. Phone logs proving late-night threats. The journal entries where she wrote his name in trembling ink. And then, the confession. The recording of his interrogation where he admitted he was with her that night, his voice shaking, his excuses crumbling. The jury leaned forward, their faces tightening with every detail. The crowd gasped at the evidence, each revelation like a nail hammered into his coffin. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand, my palms sweating. The oath felt heavy on my tongue, but I spoke with clarity. I told them how he pointed at me at the funeral, how he branded me a murderer while my sister lay in her coffin, how he tried to bury me under his lies because he was too afraid to face the truth. Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to break. "I lost my sister," I said, my voice steady. "And then he tried to take my dignity, my name, my life. But I will not let him take justice from her." The courtroom fell silent. Even the judge's gavel wasn't needed to quiet the room. The defense sputtered weak arguments about stress, about accidents, about misunderstandings. But the weight of evidence was too much. When the jury returned hours later, their verdict was unanimous: guilty of second-degree murder. My husband's face twisted in rage. "This is all your fault," he spat, thrashing as officers restrained him. "If you had just stayed quiet." But his words drowned beneath the judge's sentence. 30 years in state prison. No chance of parole. The gavel struck, sealing his fate. As they dragged him away, our eyes met one last time. There was no love left, no sorrow. Only the cold satisfaction of truth finally prevailing. And as I stepped out of the courtroom, the weight I had carried since the funeral finally began to lift. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe. When the gavel fell and the sentence was spoken, the room seemed to exhale. The whispers faded, the tension cracked, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, the eyes of the world were no longer piercing through me with suspicion. They were watching him, my husband, as he was led away in chains, his head lowered, his lies stripped bare. I walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward me, but their questions had changed. "How do you feel now that justice is served? Do you have a message for your sister? What comes next for you?" For the first time, I didn't flinch. I didn't hide. I simply said, "The truth always rises. My sister can finally rest." Then I walked past them, leaving the chaos behind. That night, I returned to my parents' house. The room still smelled faintly of my sister's perfume, her photo hung on the wall, her smile frozen in a moment when life was still kind. My mother hugged me with trembling arms, whispering, "We almost believed him. Forgive us." Tears streamed down her cheeks. I held her tighter. "There's nothing to forgive. He fooled all of us." In the days that followed, I began the slow work of rebuilding myself. I attended grief counseling, where strangers listened without judgment. I visited my sister's grave, laying down fresh flowers, promising her that her voice had not been silenced in vain. I even started journaling, pouring out the words I had swallowed during those long, dark weeks when everyone thought me guilty. But healing wasn't just about grief. It was about reclaiming life. I sold the house my husband and I had shared. Every corner reeked of betrayal. I started fresh in a small apartment across town, where no one knew the echoes of my pain. I enrolled in a cooking class, something I had always dreamed of but never dared to do under his shadow. Kneading dough, chopping herbs, feeling life in my hands, it became therapy. Slowly, the whispers in the community changed too. People who once recoiled from me in church now approached me at the grocery store to say, "We're sorry. We were wrong." Some avoided me out of shame, unable to face the part they had played in believing his lie. But I no longer carried their judgment. Their shame belonged to them, not me. And one evening, standing on my balcony as the sun dipped low and painted the sky gold, I realized something. My husband had stolen my sister, tried to steal my dignity, and almost crushed my spirit, but he had failed. I was still here, breathing,
Standing.
healing. Justice had taken him away, and healing was bringing me back. Healing was slow, but it was steady. Each day, the weight on my chest grew lighter. I learned to smile again, first in small, fragile moments, like the smell of coffee in the morning or the warmth of sunlight on my skin. Then in bigger ways, like laughing freely with my parents, something I hadn't done in years. The community watched my journey closely. At first, their stares carried guilt. Now, they carried admiration. People who once whispered behind my back began to approach me with kindness. "You're stronger than we ever realized," one neighbor told me. Another pressed my hand and whispered, "Your sister would be proud." Those words stayed with me. They reminded me that my story wasn't only about loss, it was about survival. I poured myself into rebuilding. I started a small online catering business, using the recipes my sister and I had once experimented with in her kitchen. Orders trickled in slowly at first, but soon my inbox was full. Customers praised the food, but many also praised the courage behind it. "There's something healing in every bite," one message read, and I cried when I saw it. It was during one of my deliveries that I met Daniel. He was a journalist covering local stories, polite but persistent. "I know you've been through more than anyone should," he said gently, "but your resilience is something people need to hear about." I hesitated. My life had been dissected enough by strangers, my pain twisted into gossip. But something in his eyes, earnest, steady, felt different. He wasn't chasing scandal, he was chasing truth. Over time, our paths crossed more. Coffee turned into conversations, conversations into laughter. I never intended to open my heart again, but somehow, without forcing it, I found myself leaning on him. He didn't try to fix me. He simply stood beside me, letting me be broken, letting me heal at my own pace. One evening, as we walked past the river where the lights danced on the water, he said softly, "You've been defined by what he did to you. But that's not who you are. You're more than his betrayal, more than your sister's tragedy. You're a survivor." For the first time, I believed it. I wasn't just the woman who had been humiliated at a funeral. I wasn't just the sister of the dead, or the wife of a murderer. I was myself, rebuilt, scarred but stronger. As I looked up at the stars that night, I whispered a promise to my sister. "I'll keep living. For you. For me. For us." And for the first time in months, the future didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a door waiting to be opened. Months passed, and the seasons shifted like pages in a book. The scars on my heart were still there, but they no longer defined me. I had learned to carry them without letting them crush me. The catering business grew faster than I ever expected. What started as small orders turned into weddings, corporate events, and charity fundraisers. Each dish carried a piece of my sister's memory, her laughter folded into the recipes, her warmth baked into the bread. People weren't just buying food, they were buying hope. The courthouse ordeal had once made me the center of gossip, but now, people whispered for different reasons. They admired my resilience, my refusal to break. Some even came to me privately, confessing that they too had lived under the shadow of abuse, thanking me for showing them that survival was possible. Daniel stayed by my side, quietly, never rushing me. Some nights, when the world felt too heavy, we would sit in silence, the comfort of his presence enough to remind me that not every man was a monster. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he told me, "You don't owe your future to your past. You owe it to yourself." And I knew he was right. The day finally came when I visited my husband's prison. Not for him, for me. I needed to see the man who had tried to bury me with lies, who had called me a killer at my sister's funeral. Through the thick glass, he looked older, smaller, stripped of his arrogance. He sneered, but the fire in his eyes was gone. I leaned forward and spoke softly but firmly. "You took my sister. You tried to take my name, my dignity, my life. But you failed. I'm still here. I'm stronger than you ever imagined. And you'll spend the rest of your days watching me live free while you rot behind bars." For the first time, he had no reply. I walked away without looking back. That night, I lit a candle by my sister's photo. The flame flickered gently, casting warm light across her smiling face. "It's over," I whispered. "Justice is done. And I'll keep living for us both." As the candle burned, I realized that closure wasn't about forgetting, it was about reclaiming my power. My story had begun with humiliation and loss, but it didn't end there. It ended with freedom, with strength, with a future that was mine to shape. And as I closed my journal, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace.